Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck, and we're going to talk about all the books that I read in December. December was both a good reading month for me and not a good reading month because I read 10 books, which I felt very good about, but I didn't really like very many of the books that I read. Most of them were 3-star ratings. I think there were 1 or 2 that had 4 stars, but like nothing that I really loved. The first book that I read in December is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This takes place in a world in which there is extreme stratification between the rich nobility and the poor, who are more often slaves or like indentured servants. Some get to the point of being like maybe a merchant or craftsman, but most live pretty terrible lives at the mercy of the nobility. In this world, they have an unusual kind of magic that is called allomancy. In allomancy, people are able to ingest different metals and then burn those metals in their body. Different metals do different things. So like pewter makes your body stronger. We follow 2 characters in this story, one of which is Vin. She is a young street urchin type character, and the other is Kelsier, who I'm not 100% sure if that's how you say his name, but that's how I've been pronouncing it. He is more, I think he's in his like 30s or 40s, and he is a high-level con artist character. Eventually, these 2 characters meet up, and they start to pull together a band of people with various backgrounds and abilities to create this band of con artists who are trying to change the world because they live in a pretty terrible world right now. This is the first book of a 3-book series, and I was not that impressed with it. There were many parts of it that I just was not very impressed by. I thought the writing was just kind of so-so. It's very plain, very straightforward, and while sometimes fantasy writing can be like too flowery, too elaborate, and they just like trying too hard, I do think that this, for me personally, this was a little too plain. So again, with something like that, that's a personal preference. Maybe some people really like how plain and straightforward the writing is, so like that's just a personal preference for reading. But to me, I found the writing to not be immersive. I did think that the world building was done well, the explanation of the magic system was done well, because it is a complex magic system in some ways, or it's maybe not complex, but it's kind of unusual. It is very different, and that was really interesting, and it was explained in a way that was very easy to understand, and it was used in a way that it really made sense how it worked. So I did think that that was done well. Most of my problems were with the characters and the relationships. Personally, I didn't find many of the characters especially interesting or compelling. I didn't really feel connected or interested to either of the main characters in this book. I am a very character-focused reader, and so when the characters aren't really engaging to me, when the character development isn't really great, and when those relationship and the relationship building isn't really there, I just am not connected to the story. In terms of the plot, I felt like the plot was kind of so-so for me. Most of the book was fairly slow, and while it did have some twists that I didn't see coming, overall, I found the book really predictable. It wasn't like a terrible book. I just like wasn't impressed with it, and I really wanted to be because I know how much people love this. So because it wasn't like bad, and I do think it has potential, and knowing how much people love it, I am going to give the second book a try. I'm not going to just give up on it because I wasn't a huge fan of this first one, so I will be reading the second book after this one. I'll try to get to it in 2018. And overall, I gave The Final Empire 3 out of 5 stars. Next in December, I read The Starlit Wood by various authors. This is an anthology of fairy tale retellings by multiple fantasy authors. It has a story in here by Shauna McGuire, which is part of why I wanted to read this, because I really enjoy her Wayward Children series. And this one, I thought there were some ups and downs most of the time with anthologies. Like, I can't give a rave review because it's so many different stories and so many different authors that, like, you know, there may be some real gems, but then there are also some real flops in the book. And so, like, this one also, it wasn't necessarily, like, throughout amazing, but there were a couple stories that I really, really liked. One of my favorite stories in this book was In the Desert Like a Bone by Seanan McGuire, which is kind of a Red Riding Hood retelling, and this one has a really interesting, like, Western vibe to it, which I actually really enjoyed. I don't really read Westerns, and I thought this one was really good. Another story that I really enjoyed in this book was Penny for a Match Mister by Garth Nix, and this one was just a really interesting twist on the little match girl story, which is not a story that I've ever liked before, but I did really enjoy his version of it in this one, which weirdly, that was the other one in this book that was kind of like a Western. And again, I don't really read Westerns, but now I'm thinking maybe I should read some more, because, like, my two favorite stories from this book were both Westerns. Overall, I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars, again, because it had some highs and some lows. The next book that I read is The Princess Saves Herself in This One by Amanda Lovelace. So this is a book of poetry, and as I've said in previous videos, I've been trying to read more poetry this year. So I picked this one up because I have heard a lot of positive reviews and people recommending it. And I personally didn't really identify with the experiences that she was expressing in this book. That being said, I did think it was really good. So while I was reading it, like the day I bought it, I sat down and read it cover to cover, which is not something that you usually do with, like, a book of poetry. And with this one, while you could read each poem individually, ultimately the book is a narrative, actually. And I really liked actually reading it that way, and really, like, sitting down and just reading the narrative in its entirety. As I said, even though I didn't really identify with the experiences that she was talking about, you could really feel the vulnerability that she had while writing these. And to me, it felt like, you know, like if you were talking to a friend who was being very vulnerable and telling you something really personal, you wouldn't go just like, you know, hold on a second, like, hold that thought, I got some stuff to do, we'll pick this back up some other time. So it felt like that to me, that I felt like I didn't want to put the book down because it was so personal and so vulnerable, that I felt like I had to just, like, give it my full attention and sit there and read it cover to cover. So this one, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars because of that feeling, because I thought it did a really good job of really showing that vulnerability and making you feel how personal the experience is for her. Next, I read The Foxhole Court by Nora Sakovic. So this is a story about a sports team. There's an imaginary sport called Exy, and at this school, the coach for the Exy team kind of takes on wayward youths and gives them something to do by by putting together this team. So the whole team, they all have kind of dark pasts or troubled pasts, and he brings together this motley crew of characters to create this Exy team. So this book I wanted to read because it's one that's very often recommended to people. Like, if you liked The Raven Cycle by Maggie Stiefvater, they usually recommend that you read The Foxhole Court by Nora Sakovic, because it has some very similar themes and similar characters, and also in the way that The Raven Boys is not really about, like, you know, finding a dead Welsh king. It's actually about the characters and their relationships and how much they care for each other. Similarly, this book is not really about sports. It's not really about Exy. It's about the characters and their relationships and how much they care for each other and how they build those relationships. So while I was reading this one, personally, I had a really hard time getting into it because it this one is a contemporary novel. It does not have any magical elements in it, and that is something that I like struggle with. I'm very much a fantasy reader, so even if there's like just a little bit of a fantasy element, that like helps me stay engaged, and that was something that I really struggled with this one, that I just like couldn't get into it. I also felt like some of the things that created like the conflict or the drama felt a little too forced or a little too contrived for me, trying to force this feeling of drama. There's one character in here who is very similar to Ronan. I've heard him be described as like a mix between Ronan and Kavinsky from The Raven Cycle, and I can definitely see that. But I just like couldn't really connect to any of the characters. I didn't really like any of them or care about any of them. This book does have some characters who are those like morally gray characters, which, you know, I've said I don't mind morally gray characters, but sometimes there is like some line that they cross that I just go like, nope, I can't with you right now. And this book had that a little bit for me. There was one character that like, he just went too far with something and just crossed a line that I was like, I just can't like you anymore. I just can't do it. And so I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. I'm not sure if I'm gonna continue the series. I might, but I'm really conflicted because I just didn't love it, and it was just very hard for me to read it because I just wasn't into it. Next, I read Finnegan of the Rock by Melina Marchetta. It follows Finnegan, who is in exile from his homeland. He comes from a country that has been walled off by a magical curse, and so the exiles cannot go home. No one can get in or out of that country, and so now for the last 10 years, I think, Finnegan has been traveling around finding groups of exiles from his homeland and trying to kind of take care of them, make sure that they're okay. The story starts with Finnegan finding a young girl, Evangeline, who claims that she is able to see into the walled off kingdom and see that the heir to the throne is still alive and that they need to go and get him. So that's how the story starts off. They go off on their adventure to collect all of the other characters that they will need to try and break back into this kingdom that has been walled off for years by magic. I thought that this book had a lot of potential. I didn't necessarily love this book, but I do want to continue the series. I liked that this one it went much darker and grittier than a lot of YA fantasy does, and the character Evangeline is very cool. She is much more like vicious and like willing to do whatever it takes than a lot of characters are. And I really appreciated how they did go in a direction that was more gritty and more like vicious than I was expecting. I did find pretty much most of the characters kind of annoying. The 2 main characters were like very frustrating a lot of the time, and so again, it wasn't like a favorite, but I definitely thought it had potential, and I've heard that this series gets better as it goes on, so I do really want to read the next book. The second book I believe is called Froy of the Exiles, so I do plan to get to that one pretty soon, and hopefully I'll love the series more as it goes on. This one I gave 3.5 out of 5 stars. Then in December, while I was on break, I read the Shiver Trilogy by Maggie Stiefvater, or it might be called the Mercy Falls Trilogy, I'm not 100% sure. The first book in the series is Shiver, the second book is Linger, and the third book is Forever. So I wanted to read more books by Maggie Stiefvater, so that is why I got this trilogy. This series was very different from what I've read by Maggie Stiefvater previously. It was very different from The Raven Boys. It's much more like romance focused. And less focused on friendships. It very much had a like, oh, once you have a romantic relationship, you kind of just like, who needs friends? Just forget about them. Which was very weird to me. I could also tell that her writing has, I think, improved over time, because I love the writing so much of The Raven Boys, but this one did not have that same like atmospheric and immersive feel to me as The Raven Boys. Oh, I haven't even said what it's about. This series is about werewolves. So this takes place in Mercy Falls, Montana, I think, in which there are werewolves that live in the forest. We follow Grace, who lives on the edge of the woods, and there is one wolf in particular that she is kind of obsessed with, and she calls her Wolf. And the werewolves in this series are very interesting in that they are not controlled by the moon, but they are controlled by the weather. When they are cold, they turn into wolves, and when hot, they are human. So in the winter, they are in the form of wolves, and in the summer, they are in the form of humans. And so we follow Grace as she meets her wolf in wolf and human form, and we follow their relationship throughout the series. In some of the later books, some more side characters are introduced, who I actually liked the side characters more than the main characters. I thought that the main two characters were actually very boring and bland. I didn't think that they were especially interesting or compelling. They just seemed kind of meh to me, but I did like Isabel and Cole, who were some side characters that were introduced in the later books, and I thought they were much more interesting. And I also believe that Sinner, the companion novel, is about Isabel and Cole, which is also why I do want to read that, because they were kind of my favorite characters out of this series. So I have heard a lot of people say that this series is kind of like Twilight, which I do agree with. It's about werewolves, the setting is kind of similar to Forks, a lot of the themes are very similar. Luckily though, this series is less creepy than Twilight, I think, because at least the main characters are the same age. It's not like a 200-year-old vampire and then like a 16-year-old human. The two main like love interests are actually both teenagers and both the same age, so like I appreciated that. This one, as I said, the writing was not as great as I was hoping that it would be. I found the main characters kind of boring. The like intense focus on the romantic relationships, even like they weren't especially interesting romantic relationships, and it was just very lackluster to me. I gave the entire series 3 out of 5 stars. Then in December, I read Wild Embers, Poems of Rebellion, Fire and Beauty by Nikita Gill, and this is a book of poetry, and I enjoyed this one. There are definitely parts from this that I underlined and starred. I thought that it was very interesting, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. And last up in December, I read The Language of Thorns by Leigh Bardugo. This is a collection of short stories that all take place in the Grishaverse. This actually was not exactly what I was expecting. I thought that this was going to be short stories that took place in the Grishaverse, which is the world that Leigh Bardugo has created for her Shadow and Bone trilogy and her Six of Crows duology, and that it would be kind of like maybe some history or backstory or side stories about the characters. And it actually wasn't that. It's fairy tales. Like, this is a book of their fairy tales, the fairy tales that the characters in the Grishaverse would know. And I thought that was actually really cool. Like, it wasn't what I was expecting, but I ended up really loving it. I thought this was so great. And she did a really great job of getting that really classic fairy tale feel, which can be hard to do and to manufacture. So these are not exactly like fairy tale retellings, because I think that they're very different and very original, which I really appreciated, but they are fairy tale inspired. So you can definitely see themes and concepts that may have been inspired by fairy tales that we have. Like, there is one that is inspired by the Minotaur myth, and there's one that's inspired by like maybe a little Hansel and Gretel, but also a little bit of like the gingerbread man kind of story. There's one that's inspired by, you know, like mermaids. She was both like really different and creative with it, but also really held on to that classic fairy tale theme or like vibe. And these were pretty dark. Like, some of these fairy tales got very dark in the way that real classic fairy tales do. So I really liked that, and I had a great time reading this. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Thinking back, maybe I should have done like 4.5 out of 5 stars, but this was definitely my favorite read of the month. Alright, that is all for my December wrap up. Thank you for watching, and until next time, bye!